Hey, Dave Rother here, and in this video I'm going to talk to you about a really intriguing little psychological kind of glitch which is going to make your content and your ads and every kind of thing that you create and your products that you create online that bit more consumable, and to drag people along and get them to carry on watching and carry on engaging. You know, the longer that you can keep hold of people, the more chance you've got of building a relationship with them and educating them about your products and showing them how it can be useful to them and eventually turning them into customers. So it's really important to take people from point A to point B to point C, you know, and take them along this journey from this very first point where you hook them in at their first interaction with you, which is probably going to be some kind of online post or ad, or some kind of, you know, very brief interaction online which they've got the chance of scrolling past, and then take them to point B where you can start to educate them a bit more about your products or entertain them a bit more or build that relationship. But that all important first point is point A, which is where you actually hook people in. So this is going to be my photorealistic illustration of a fishhook. So point A, this is where you're probably going to get people on social media, you know, with an ad. It's the first interaction they've got with you, and you've got to hook them in. But then how do you actually get them along to point B, whereby you can start to educate them? So you can start to educate them and tell them about your product. And then after that, you can probably get them to a point where you can start to pitch them about how they can buy your product. And then the next point where you can get them to a point where they actually purchase. And the human glitch which we can leverage to get people along this kind of line from newly hooked person to somebody who knows, likes and trusts you or your brand and actually purchases is intrigue. So intrigue is a really powerful psychological principle that we can leverage as marketers. And to kind of illustrate this, I want to talk to you about something called gap theory. So gap theory is essentially represents an insatiable desire. Once you create a gap in somebody's knowledge, an insatiable desire to have that gap filled, right? So this is most kind of notably and probably at one far end of the spectrum, you can see in clickbait headlines, right? So you'll never guess what X so-and-so happens, what happened next will shock you. It's creating a gap in people's knowledge. And, you know, that's a very simplistic and a very kind of the spammy end of the spectrum. But by asking questions, by creating intrigue in your marketing, then it gets people along to the next stage. And this is crucial, you know, because if we think back to the other principles of virality, then one of them is simplicity. You know, you've only got a certain amount of time to engage somebody on social media. It's generally, in terms of videos, it's 3 to 5 seconds. In those first 3 to 5 seconds of that video, you need to give them a good enough reason to carry on watching. And the very best reason, the most likely that you will reason that you will get to get somebody to carry on watching is by using intrigue, because you create this gap in their knowledge which they need to be filled. So they'll naturally carry on coming along that journey with you until it's filled. So this is referred to in a lot of different ways. So another one is loops, opening and closing loops is another way of talking about it in the marketing sphere. So so at any one point, you can open a loop, but you don't want to close it, because the moment you close it, then people have a complete knowledge and they're like, okay, cool, I can go home now, I'm done, I've got everything. This is where, in terms of headlines and blog headlines, a lot of people make this error that they tell the story of the whole, they tell the entire story in the headline. And you know, this is why a lot of people will share. There was a guy who did an experiment on this. He created an absolute nonsense headline, and just to see how many people would share it. It's been done a few times on the web. People will literally see a headline, and I've been guilty of this too. See a headline which tells the entire story, or seems to tell the entire story, and people will share it without even consuming the content. So we want to avoid that at all costs, because we don't want people just to share our content and then not to carry on consuming, right? So we need to avoid closing these loops. As soon as we, you know, start to tell a story, before we close that loop, we need to take them onto the next loop. Before we close that one, we need to take them onto the next one. So lots of different ways of representing this idea of gap theory, of creating gaps in people's knowledge and not resolving it too soon before we got them to the next stage in the journey. So just to talk about this in terms of like actually advertising and actually selling your stuff, it's important to consider like how ads work and how the whole marketing journey should work. And you know, in terms of an ad, in terms of like a Facebook ad or something which compels, but say we're talking about like a direct response ad right now, then say this is your ad right here. There it is. So it's realistic again. So in terms of this ad, the only job that this ad has got, right, in reality, is to get people through to the sales page that you have so lovingly created, or the website where your product resides, right? So with this ad, we don't want to sell a product, we need to sell the click. So we need to get people from the ad or from the content or from whatever it is to the next stage of the journey. Again, talking in terms of simplicity, we don't want to give people too much to deal with. We don't want to give the whole story away. So if you start to master this concept of opening loops and not closing them, of creating gaps in people's knowledge, of creating gaps about your industry or about your product or about whatever it is, then you're going to start to get a lot more engagement online. That engagement translates into more shares, more customers, more people in your sphere of potential buyers. It turns into more clicks because, you know, in terms of like actually getting people from an ad to a sales page, if you create intrigue, they're far more likely to click through and therefore far more likely to buy. The more people that you can get to click through there, at least you can go back then and retarget them, and once they've shown a certain level of interest. So intrigue is a huge thing to master, and it's going to be specific. It's going to be, you know, different for every single person watching this video right now. But, you know, things to kind of bear in mind is, what questions can you ask your audience? How can you inspire their imagination? What is it about your industry? What unique information do you have about your industry? How can you make that sound really juicy? How can you start to draw people along a journey towards your product without saying, hey, here's my stuff, come buy it? You know, if we start to master these kind of concepts of creating a relationship with people and creating a journey for people, this is how the whole online world really works now. You know, we're moving away from direct, like, here's my stuff, come and buy it. That just doesn't work so well anymore because there's so much noise online, there's so much information online that people want to be educated and entertained at the same time. So by creating intrigue and by creating gaps in people's knowledge, not only are we getting them further along the line towards becoming a customer, we're also getting more engagement from them. We're helping them enjoy themselves online. And guess what? If we're doing that as well, then we're going to be viewed more favorably by social media platforms. So we talk specifically about Facebook for a second. Facebook love engagement. Facebook love people being happy on their platform. In fact, it's one of their highest priorities, and a lot of the time they'll penalize advertisers. In fact, all of the time they'll penalize advertisers and content producers if that information, if that content, if those ads aren't engaging. It's the same with any platform. It's the same with LinkedIn. It's the same with YouTube. If your content isn't engaging, it gets ranked lower, and you gradually get ranked out of existence. So by finding all these kind of unique ways to engage people, it's not just helping with your ability to sell product, it's also helping with your engagement on these social media platforms. So again, it goes back to the age-old adage that a rising tide lifts all ships. And if you can start to get this engagement, then it's going to bring everything closer to you. It's going to bring your cost per click down. It's going to bring the amount of shares up. It's going to bring your reactions, your general engagement online is going to be much higher and much more favorable. And it's little things like this. It's little things like engaging psychological tricks, like intrigue, like gap theory, which are going to help you do that. So I hope this video is useful to you. I hope this gives you some kind of inspiration to go and find ways to create questions and gaps in your customers and your audience's knowledge.